evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm just going to give it another few seconds as folks continue to come in. But thank you so much for joining us for our 30-minute chat and learn on reimagining the return to office movement. Very happy for you to be with us today. And quick plug also, if you're looking for more professional development opportunities like this one, do check out our Amplifying Black Excellence Summit next week. We are very excited to present 2 days of workshops and fireside chats, actually kicking off with a chat with our very own Sienna Brown, who you'll be hearing from today. And then we also have a virtual job fair later in the week as well. So very excited for that. So yeah, without further ado, thank you very much. You can register right there on that link that's in the chat. But I'm going to kick us off. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon for this chat and learn on reimagining the return to office movement. This is something that I think is top of mind for many of us. So very excited to be discussing this. And if you want to go to the next slide, Ria, you can just briefly see our code of conduct here. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but of course we want to just make sure we have a great conversation in this safe space. And on this next slide, you can actually see that this is a SHRM eligible event. I'm actually putting that SHRM code into the chat there. So if you're a member of SHRM, you can use this for your accreditation there. And if we go to the next slide, just want to tell you a little bit more about PowerToFly. For those of you that don't know, we help organizations attract top talent and retain engaged employees with solutions that simplify recruitment, enhance employee satisfaction, and drive long-term business success. So feel free to just respond to any of your reminder emails if you'd love more information on us. But without further ado, let's jump into today's topic, the great office return. Will 2025 be the end of remote work? This was actually a headline back on December 6th that Forbes had, and to quote Forbes writer Rachel Wells, there are so many conflicting ideas regarding remote work, which make this an ongoing workplace debate. And the news regarding big name companies like Amazon and Dell mandating 5-day-a-week RTO in 2025 leaves many scratching their heads and concerned about where they might end up working in 2025 and beyond. So let's look at what's happening in that world. And speaking of Amazon, if you go to the next slide here, you can actually see a quote from their CEO. And this was announced when the retail giant announced in September 2024 that employees would need to return to the office 5 days a week. CEO Andy Jassy wrote, "When we look back over the last 5 years, we continue to believe that the advantages of being together in the office are significant. We've observed that it's easier for our teammates to learn, model, practice, and strengthen our culture. Collaborating, brainstorming, and inventing are simpler and more effective. Teaching and learning from one another are more seamless, and teams tend to be better connected to one another. If anything, the last 15 months, we've been back in the office at least 3 days a week has strengthened our convictions about the benefits." I wonder if you agree or disagree with that statement. You can let us know. But on this next slide, you can see that Amazon is certainly not alone in that thinking. Other companies have already announced their return to office mandates for 2025. Those include Walmart, Dell, X, JP Morgan, Zoom, and Disney. And of course, there are many more as well. Or you can take the case of AT&T, which is actually requiring workers to return to the office despite closing 300 office locations since the pandemic forced many workers to either relocate or quit. But Andy Jassy, the Amazon CEO's reasonings might have some merit, which was found actually in PowerToFly's 2024 What Diverse Talent Wants survey that actually showed that 73% of respondents want more team building and camaraderie. Could in-person work actually help to solve this? Again, let us know in the chat. And people are being very creative when it comes to return to work. And one such thing is coffee badging. This was a very new term for me. So I'll explain what coffee badging is, because this was a very new term. I had not heard of this, but actually, this refers to the workplace trend where employees briefly come into the office, typically just long enough to grab a coffee and show face to colleagues, and then quickly leave the office to work remotely for the rest of the day. Basically, essentially fulfilling their required in office presence while minimizing the time spent at the office. And it's seen as a way to kind of get around attendance policies without fully committing to being in that day. I'm wondering if anyone actually on the chat or anyone here has actually kind of seen this as well. And thank you for jumping that video into the chat there, if people can check that out after this. But now, actually, on this next slide, let's actually dive deeper into the current state of how people are actually working. So let's look at this recent report from Flex Index that was just released in Q4 2024. So structured hybrid still dominates as the preferred work model for US companies. In fact, 43% of US companies now actually operate under a structured hybrid model. And on this next slide, you can see that 89% of structured hybrid companies require 2 to 3 days per week in the office. That was actually a 5% increase in Q3. So those days in the office are starting to get higher and higher. This next slide actually shows you the breakdown of what kind of industries are approaching, how they are approaching work. 96% of technology companies offer work location flexibility, and then insurance and financial services are actually rounding out the top three. And then on the next slide, lastly, let's look at the size of the company and how that might affect company decisions. So larger companies continue to lean more heavily towards structured hybrid policies. And you can see that smaller companies, folks with 500 employees or less, are very much leaning into that fully flexible realm. And then just I want to ask the question to everyone here on this next slide. Are these stats actually aligned with your own organization's approach? So give that a thought. Let us know in the chat. And before we bring in Sienna, I want to talk a little bit about what workers are actually thinking. So on this next slide, you can see some results actually from Forbes that were taken from a survey just after Amazon's announcement. So 73% of professionals are actually reconsidering their positions. So Amazon and other companies might see a huge turnover. 77% see RTO policies as a control mechanism rather than a productivity measure. And in-office workers spend just over $1,000 monthly on in-office and community expenses. That's more than double the average hybrid worker. So a lot to take in there. And on this next slide, we're going to show you some results from PowerToFly's very own 2025 What Diverse Talent Survey. And this survey is actually not released yet, so you're all getting a little sneak preview of some of these results. And actually, over 50% of respondents want more flexible schedules, while 78% want more work-life balance. And that's actually up from 64% in 2024. So flexibility, work-life balance, very high on top of workers' minds. When presented with the option of shorter work weeks, 54% of respondents would actually prefer flexible schedules over a shorter work week, and that's up from 45% in 2024. So very interesting. People actually prefer flexibility over overall shorter work weeks. And while many businesses are hoping a return to office will improve engagement, actually 80% of respondents said they are in fact very engaged at work. So people are pretty engaged no matter what. And we'll conclude on this next slide there with a few more stats here, which is according to Indeed, women are actually 25% more likely to favor remote work than men. This could be because traditional caregiver roles still often fall to women, and remote work does provide that flexibility. Remote.com cites that 17% of disabled workers say their workplace isn't accessible at all. And remote work, of course, really does open up those accessibility options. And finally, the Williams Institute at UCLA said in their 2024 survey that 47% of LGBTQ workers state that they face open discrimination or microaggressions in their office. Can remote work help on this? We've actually done a few talks on the benefits of remote work, especially for trans employees. So very much top of mind in terms of inclusion there. And I'm going to bring in Sienna, but I'll just say on this next slide here that regardless of where you fall in the debates, it's really undeniable that both workers and companies really going to be facing some pretty difficult conversations in 2025. Maybe some of you are having those conversations already. But I want to bring in our speaker, our featured speaker today, our head of growth here at PowerToFly, Sienna Brown, who I am so grateful to work with every day, and who you'll also hear from at our Amplifying Black Excellence conversation next week. So Sienna, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rob. And I'm really excited for all of you who are in the room and watching on YouTube as well. I'm excited for this conversation today, and I also want to encourage us to come on camera if you would like to. You are welcome just as you are. It's always great to see faces and interact. And just a reminder that as Rob and I go through some of these questions, we also want to be able to hear what is top of mind for you. What are some of the questions that you have as well, so we can be able to support in the best way possible.
Amazing. So if you want to take down the slides, Ria, I have some questions for Sienna, but then as she said, we'd love to hear from you. I know some of you also pre-submitted questions as well, so we'll get to as many of those as possible. But I wanted to just start here, Sienna, which is there's clearly a divide between companies returning to the office while workers actually crave greater flexibility, as we showed in our What Diverse Talent Wants survey. So what advice would you give to leaders if they are struggling with this?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think, of course, it depends on your role, your title, and your level of leadership. Are you able to make direct impact on decisions, or can you influence some of the decisions that other leaders are making? And I think the first thing that's most important is really acknowledging and addressing employee concerns, right? As Rob was sharing before, one of the biggest things was also transparency in regards to how these decisions were being made, the decisions that were being made, and also thinking about the impact and the implication of the employees that work for these organizations. So if you are going through a return to office policy and really having to start integrating that in your organization, I would create space to communicate with your employees, but then also create space for them to share feedback, right? And doing that through a lens of both empathy as well as understanding. But even when thinking about your organizational policies and how they may shift or not shift in the future, really being able to hear those employee insights might actually be able to give you all what you need to adapt your policies so that you're able to retain your top employees, but then also really being transparent and communicating the reasons why and the reasons behind the decision to be able to tie what the decision was to being able to connect that with the company's broader mission and why you all are having return to office mandates if you are. The other thing that I would just say as well is really thinking about certain use cases and leveraging flexibility within those constraints. So let's say your organization might be having a return to office. Something that we've seen in a lot of conversations with other leaders and executives is that although there's an organizational policy within different departments, you are actually able to see different leaders adapting that policy to best fit their team's needs. So thinking about what are some of those flexibility desires that your team has and why? Are they caregivers? Might they have a disability? They might live further away from the office than others and aren't able to do that in alignment with kid drop off, right? Whatever the reasons might be, really thinking about what some of those smaller adjustments could be, whether it's flexible start times, remote work for certain tasks or days, or occasional work from home days, even as benefits. And again, thinking about that in alignment with actually listening to your employees and what some of the impact of this policy might have. And the last thing I'll share is, of course, we need to balance business goals and business decisions with the employees' needs as well, because we can't reach our business objectives unless we have individuals who are engaged and aligned with the company's work and also the company culture to be able to reach the business goals and objectives that we have. So if you are a leader, I would, and even if you aren't, for all of us, it's a good practice to really work on how are we measuring success? How are we measuring productivity? Does success mean being in the office 5 days a week? Does success mean being able to reach the objectives that we set? And really thinking about output and impact over time spent in a physical office and starting to gain and gather some of that data to have a use case of, we just implemented an RTO policy. What does that mean for our organization, and how are we tracking that impact based on how we're defining success in a month, in 3 months, or in 6 months? This way, the organization will be able to actually analyze that data and say, okay, is this working for us and is it not? What is the impact that it's had on productivity, on business outcomes, on employee retention, and then being able to revisit that in the future as well.
Thank you. And your second point actually ties really well into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is inclusion in remote work. So what role do you see remote work playing in advancing companies' inclusion goals? And how can companies really ensure that that return to office policies, they're not inadvertently creating other inequities?
I love that question. And ironically enough, I'll use myself as a perfect example. The first thing that I always think about is companies, I was going to say individuals, but a company's ability to expand their access to talent. When an organization is able to specifically have a remote first mindset, it really eliminates a lot of geographical barriers, right? So it allows for companies to be able to recruit talent, not just from diverse locations and backgrounds, but also being able to open up the sphere of who you can attract or not. I was giggling as I said this because I'm from New York originally, and I've been living in Spain for the last decade. And so for me, remote work has always been a part of the way that I look for opportunities and the reasons why I stay. And so thinking about being able to expand access to different talent where you could have really great talent that might not be in a 10 or 15-mile radius from the offices, but really thinking about how might that also adapt your talent strategy as well. And interestingly enough, in our flagship report that Rob mentioned before, 50% of the What Diverse Talent Wants respondents said that they wouldn't even consider a role that's at least not partially remote. So when we're thinking about that lens of inclusion, thinking about what does that mean in regards to not just who we are, sorry, my dog is barking, not just who we are able to hire, but who we're able to retain. And that goes hand in hand with inclusive environments, right? So flexible arrangements and being conscious of how can we accommodate certain employees. And I'll just share some data as well that we saw in our survey, but 25% of women are more likely to favor remote work than men. 17% of disabled workers say that their physical workplace isn't accessible at all. And 47% of LGBTQ plus workers stated that they actually faced open discrimination or microaggressions in the office. So when we think about some of this through a lens of inclusion as well, really being able to say that we're not inadvertently creating inequities by making a specific shift, but instead empowering the sentiment of accessibility. And what does that look like? And what does that look like for whom? For who? And the last thing that I would say is a couple of ways to actually mitigate this is, again, conducting equity audits. And this goes back to listening to our employees, right? But being able to assess the impact of RTO policies, but also being able to look at that through various identity groups to be able to see if some individuals are more or less affected than others. And the other thing that I would say, and we see this a lot in hybrid models specifically, but being able to start standardizing opportunities. So if you think about it, you're 7 people in a room and you're having a team meeting and you have 1 or 2 individuals that are remote. Will the individuals that are remote be able to have the same type of engagement, of space to share, of discussion, and of opportunity as those who are in the room? When afterwards they might get a coffee and then go talk about the meeting that they just had. So thinking about how opportunities and hybrid meetings, but then also events or whatever else your organization might do, actually creates opportunities where both the individuals that are remote and in person are able to have the same types of career growth, mentorship, access to leadership, and that they have equal available opportunities through processes that also recognize visibility and recognition. And the last thing I'll say, just thinking and looking at time, is I keep going back to leading with transparency, right? I think a lot of times in organizations, when decisions are made that will impact the lives and the livelihoods of many employees, leading with transparency and visibility and communicating the rationale, but not only the rationale, but having individuals feel as if they are a part of the process. This way, you'll be able to gain that buy-in and you won't see an increase in individuals leaving or being disengaged with the organization because of this decision.
Yeah, so much of the feedback, or so much I was reading in my research, people were saying is like these decisions were made in a vacuum. And I think very much people want to feel a part of that decision. And since we just have about 9 minutes left, I wanted to answer some of the questions we got pre-submitted. And one was actually on measuring success. That was something you already mentioned, Sienna. So how are or how could organizations measure the success for hybrid workplaces?
That's a great question. And I think also this goes back to looking at how is the organization defining success with deciding to go hybrid or deciding to go back in office. And so a couple of things that I would say is in the same way that companies often have engagement surveys, either integrating and being able to have opportunities for employees to give feedback and measure qualitatively and quantitatively what is the impact and how are we defining success for being in a hybrid workplace. I think the other thing that would be really important to do as well is within the organization, whether on the leadership team or in teams as well, being able to identify what does success mean for each department and how does that actually align to what does success mean for the organization, specifically thinking about the location of their individuals. Are they in office or are they remote? Or are they both? And the last thing that I would say also is going back to what I was just speaking about in regards to productivity. Are we measuring hours and time, or are we measuring reaching our business outcomes? And we saw this happen a lot in the pandemic. I don't have the data top of mind, but seeing that a lot of organizations were actually a lot more productive and they were able to meet their business objectives with remote workforces. And so when we think about what happened around 5 years ago, we were actually able to see a direct correlation with employee engagement, employee happiness, employee satisfaction, employee retention, with that ability to be able to work remote. But thinking about what does that mean in today's day and age, and what are some of the core KPIs that we want to be looking at to decide for each organization, what does success look like in regards to our business outcomes and our employee experience as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's making me think I'd love when people are gathering feedback. Maybe one thing to even ask is like, what are workers spending? I mentioned that workers are spending in a hybrid scenario, or in office scenario, $1,000 extra. Like, if we go more remote, is that going down? Are you incorporating that extra $1,000 into salaries for people who are hybrid, and maybe the people who are remote don't get
Yeah.
that extra money? Like, I think there's a lot of things there that people could be asking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just piggyback off of what you're saying, Rob, but I would even think about what are the implications in regards to the cost of living for employees if they need to move to be
Hmm.
closer to an office where they're now mandated to return to the office, right? So let's say that you've decided to move 60 minutes outside of the city 5 years ago when the pandemic happened so that you're able to have a better quality of life. And let's say 2 hours and you have to decide to move into New York City so that you can be in the office 5 days a week, what is the impact that that might have on an employee, their family, their day-to-day life that might not be considered as well when thinking about integrating some of these RTO mandates?
Well, that really goes right into another question that we had pre-submitted, which is what considerations should employees who have taken career breaks or given have caregiving responsibilities, like how should they work that in? Because there's been so many people who were like, I wasn't a caregiver, now I am for various reasons, or being home is easier, with it when their kids come home. So how should those employees and companies take that into account?
That's a very loaded question that I don't know I would be able to get into in 5 minutes, but I think a couple of things specifically to keep in mind. If you are an employee where you do have caregiving responsibilities, I would do three things in your case. Number one, document what your needs are. So let's say, like how Rob was saying, I can't come into the office until 9 a.m. because I have school drop off at 8:15, but the company might start at 8 o'clock. Documenting down what are all of those things that will be impacted, and then really creating a little bit of a pitch or negotiation when you do go to leadership so that it's very clear what it is that you're asking for. When we go back to the question of how are we defining success, communicating that that would not impact your contributions or your outcomes to the organization, and then being able to negotiate and know for you what is your happy medium. What are you okay with saying yes to, and what are you okay with saying no to? And then when it comes to the organizational point of view, again, I think this goes back to what we were talking about in regards to inclusion and then also measures of success. But taking time, which might seem overwhelming with everything that's going on, but actually taking time to hear from your employees, excuse me, and this can be in a survey, this can be in one-on-one conversations, but documenting what are some of the specific needs that caregivers, but then also from other identities might have in regards to going back to office, and then you as a leader culminating that information, bringing it to whoever you need to be able to get sign off, but really taking that extra step to understand the impact of a return to office policy, and then also being able to support yourself and other individuals on your team to be able to create a real pitch and or use case for what it is that they're going to need in the workplace.
Yeah, I definitely think having as many specifics as possible and realizing also that it's not a one size fits all scenario. What works for Rob might not be what works for Sienna, and then making sure that as a leader, you're compiling all that and taking it to another decision maker, perhaps. So thank you so much. And we're almost out of time, but I would love to kind of wrap up by talking about like trends. Like where do you see this going? Of course, in 2020, everyone was saying like we're going to be remote forever. And now there's a return to office, but maybe when those leases start to wrap up, like we're going to be going back to remote. Where do you see us going in like the next year or in the near future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like every day feels like a month, but right now I would say really quickly, there are three things that I think are really going to be trends in the workplace in regards to this. Number one is going to be technology-driven collaboration, whether that is through AI, whether that is through workforce or whatnot, but really being able to make sure that you're saying, how are we having immersive and efficient tools where we're able to collaborate not just in person, but also hybrid and or if there are individuals that are remote, but thinking through that technology driven collaboration and through a lens of productivity as well. Although we're in office, how are we still being productive? I think sustainability and DEIB integration is going to be another big one, right? And so thinking about how does this impact sustainability through commuting emissions or thinking about, again, fostering equitable opportunities for growth. And the last thing that I'll say is wellness as a metric,
Mhm.
or at least it should be, but having this trend of mental health, work-life integration really becoming key indicators for success for companies that care to really help shape how organizations define hybrid work, flexibility, and then also be able to support their teams in all environments. But
Mhm.
focusing
I
on
what
employment.
one survey I saw said I think something about 80% of companies that were surveyed are going to be increasing their mental health and wellness spending in 2025. So while maybe traditional DEI spending might decrease in some cases, I think a lot of companies are shifting that into wellness. And I think as companies continue to maybe in some cases return to the office, they are going to try to offset that with additional resources in the wellness sphere. So I think that's very much what we're going to be seeing. But thank you. I know we are at time, and thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you got something out of this very quick 30-minute session, but we're going to be sending you the recording to this so you can watch this and share this with your colleagues as well. We'll also work on sending you one sheet that you can access as well with additional information, some of the stats that I shared earlier in this call. And one last call out, check out the Amplifying Black Excellence Summit next week. 2 days of free programming, fireside chats just like this one. So if you're looking for more professional development opportunities as well as SHRM credits, you can check that out there. But otherwise, we'll see you next time at the next Power to Fly event, and have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your January. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining.